Thanks for coming to my guided reading presentation on the effects of guided reading in kindergarten students. My research question was, in what ways does guided reading affect kindergarten reading achievement? So what's most important about the study is that reading is imperative to all teachers through all ages and disciplines. This study asks the question, in what ways does guided reading affect the reading achievement of kindergarten students? For this study, multiple assessments were used on the 13 kindergarten students. Guided reading is the main component of the reading instruction for the school in this study. I anticipate that there's going to be a significant shift in reading abilities while using this program. Fountas and Pamela tell us that guided reading is a small group instructional context in which a teacher supports each reader's development of systems of strategic actions for processing new texts at increasingly challenging levels of difficulty. Basically, it just says that you do guided reading in small groups, the teacher supports the readers as they go, and that they read increasingly challenging texts. So I just want to get into what guided reading looks like before we move on. Before guided reading is started, abilities are determined, and what that means is that we do a writing record, or we look at a benchmark, and we look at something to see what their reading level already is. Then we group the students based on their abilities, their strengths and weaknesses, and things like that. Then before we get into a group, we analyze a book, we look at the text length, the amount of words on a page, the pictures, how they support the text, the storyline, new vocabulary, sight words, all that kind of stuff. Then the books are selected for a specific group, and a plan is made for the guided reading, and that plans out what we do in the guided reading lesson. So during the guided reading lesson, an introduction is given. So an introduction usually has a general storyline, points out some tricky words if there are some, points out a pattern, and things like that. Then students read the book, and while they're reading, the students are prompted and supported by the teacher. These prompts involve using meaning, using the first letter, checking parts, checking if it makes sense, rereading, and then the book is discussed at the completion of the book. Comprehension questions are made, connections, just to see if the students understand the text, because that's also part of knowing how to read, is understanding what you're reading. Following that is the teaching point, and that's what you want students to learn from the guided reading group and what's happening. And finally, it's word work, so that's when you go over sight words or endings to words or switching the first letter, making a new word, things to help them be able to break apart words and solve them. While the small group is happening, everybody else in the room, so all the other students are doing workboard. We're not going to get a lot into it because it's not in this study, but it's basically centers for all the students, and they do reading related activities that also help their reading scores. So, Richard L. Sparks, John Patton, and Amy Murdoch state, the advantage of early exposure to print can result in a more successful entry into formal reading, and thus a greater ability and desire to read. Children provided with this advantage often learn to read with greater ease than their less prepared peers. By developing strong decoding skills, they engage in more reading, which in turn exposes them to more print, enabling them to develop vocabularies and comprehension skills beyond those of their lesser skilled peers, and their exposure to print through frequent reading creates a widening academic achievement gap. Basically what this says is that early exposure to print is really important, and being in kindergarten and being some of the first students' academic setting, it's really important for us to show the students what print is, that it goes from left to right, that certain sight words, everything like that we do in kindergarten, because some of the students have never been exposed to that before. And this just says how important that part of learning is. So in this class there are 5 and 6-year-olds. So I looked at Chipwood's Yardsticks, and I pulled out a quote about 5-year-olds. He says that learning is at its best for 5-year-olds when it is both structured and exploratory, structured through a clear and predictable schedule, and exploratory through carefully constructed interest areas where children can initiate their own activity. For 6-year-olds, Chipwood says that the child is extremely receptive to all new learning. The eagerness, curiosity, imagination, drive, and enthusiasm of the 6-year-olds are perhaps never again matched in quantity or intensity during the lifespan. So what he's saying is that a kindergarten classroom needs to be structured, needs to be exploratory, and kids are excited to learn. Wood also talks about the curriculum and what he says about 5-year-old curriculum, and this is really important for what happens later in the study. He says that 5-year-old curriculum should include strengthening their reading skills by reading predictable books, books with few words, much repetition, and many pictures, then learning phonics in small groups with children at similar skill levels. So he's kind of talking a little bit about guided reading, really basic guided reading. But when we get to the 6-year-olds, he says that 6-year-olds should continue phonics learning by doing guided reading with the whole class and in small groups. They continue reading predictable books while beginning to move on to easy chapter books. When I first started teaching guided reading, most of my kids were 5, and I was pretty worried because what this says is that you should start guided reading when they're 6. So I was a little worried because most of my kids were 5 when we started guided reading. So that was something I kept in mind during this study. This is another really important quote. Chipwood says that 5-year-olds reverse letters and numbers with increasing frequency and may find reading and writing activities extremely frustrating if not closely related to their interests. He says that 6-year-olds have the ability to track visually from left to right, which readies them for reading instruction. This also made me a little anxious about teaching guided reading with 5-year-olds because it says that they're not developmentally ready to read left to right until 6. So, action research is research conducted by the person who will benefit from the research. In this case, that was me. The components of action research are as follows. You choose a focus based on a problem. So there was a problem and we looked up a focus for that. I collected data on the topic. I analyzed the data was reported and shared, and then the data invokes change. And that last part is really important because if you do the same thing that you did before, there was really no reason to have done the study at all. This study is supposed to make you change your practice and change how you feel and change how you teach and change how you think. The participants of this study were 13 kindergarten students from a small rural town in southwestern Maine. There were 8 girls and 5 boys. When I first went to start this study, I had 15 students that I thought were going to be in this study. One of them moved and one I did not get consent from, so this was my final number. It should also be noted that the district has a literacy goal, which was why this was so important. The students will demonstrate their ability to read grade level text proficiently and independently through instruction aligned with the district CCSS curriculum framework, driven with sound practice and formative assessments, resulting in at least 75% literacy proficiency across the grade level based on FAST and STAR assessments. Basically, we just need to get our kids reading at a grade appropriate level by the end of the year. The first thing I did when I was going to do this study was I needed to receive consent from the principal and the parents. So I went and I got sent off by the principal to conduct this study, and then I sent a permission slip to the parents, and I got 13 out of 14 back. Then I looked at previous data and I decided that that would be best to use because I only had 6 weeks to conduct this study, and I was worried that I wouldn't see very much growth in just 6 weeks. So I went and I looked back at fall assessments, and I decided to use 4 of the same assessments I had done in the fall. The first one I did was a journal entry, the second a letter identification assessment, the third a letter sound assessment, and the fourth were observation notes from guided reading groups, and I'll get into those when we look at the data. The next thing I did was I focused on the data, so I spent the next 6 weeks really thinking about the data and how I could use the data to move forward in our reading instruction and how I could do that in my guided reading groups. Then at the end, I reassessed the journal entry, the letter identification, the letter sound, and the observation notes. So the first assessment that I looked at was the journal entry assessment. So in the fall, the students were given a 1-line journal prompt and asked to write and draw pictures about themselves as readers using faces and words such as like, love, or do not like. The same prompt was given in the spring, but this time the students were given more lines because their writing had developed over the year. So the orange is the spring and the gray is the fall. As you can see here, in the fall, most students said that they liked reading. So 10 students said they liked reading. 1 student was totally off topic, so their score was kind of null and void. And 2 students said that they did not like reading. And the numbers got much more spread out in the spring when I reassessed. So 6 students still said that they liked reading. 3 students shifted from like to loving reading. So they said they liked reading in the, actually, I think I'm wrong. I had 1 student go from do not like to love, and 2 students go from like to love. And then I also had 3 students say that they did not like reading, and then I even had 1 student that said that they really didn't like reading. He actually used the word hate in his journal entry when he was talking about reading. The next assessment I looked at was the letter identification assessment, and this assessment was identical in the fall and the spring. Students sat with me one-on-one and were asked to name the uppercase letters off of a sheet of paper. Immediately following that, they were asked to name the lowercase letters. If the students did not give an answer in 2 seconds, I told them what the letter was. So again, the orange is the spring and the gray is the fall. As you can see, the shift went from more left to much more right. The least amount of letters that a student could identify in the fall was 34, and the most was 51. 3 students could get 51 letters in the fall. And then in the spring, when we shifted over, the least amount of letters that a student could get identify correctly was 48, and the most was all 52 letters. And as you can see also, most students in the fall could answer 51 letters. So 7 students answered 51 letters, 2 50, and then 1 each in 49 and 48. So most of the students were well up in the range from previous in the year. The next one was the letter identification assessment. As you can, sorry, I forgot what I did here. The letter identification, I then pulled it apart into uppercase letters and lowercase letters in the fall and in the spring. So that's what these graphs are. So this shows the number of students that missed the letters that they missed. So there were really only 2 numbers that stood out in the fall uppercase letters, and those were the letters Y and U. 4 students missed Y and 2 students missed U. And then in the lowercase letters, there was many that were missed multiple times, but none more than the letter Q. The Q was missed by 12 students. 12 out of 13 students could not identify the letter Q. The next 2 that stood out were the B's and D's. 6 students could not identify a D, and 4 couldn't identify a B. And then as you can see by the size of the graphs, in the spring, there was a lot of improvement. So for uppercase letters, there were only 3 misses by any student. So D, Q, and Y were missed. And then in the spring, B, W, Q, Y, and Z were missed. The Q was still missed 9 times out of 13 students, and B and Y were missed twice. For the lowercase letter assessment, for the letter sound assessment, The assessment was completed in the same way in the fall and the spring. The students sat with me one-on-one and were asked to say the sounds that the letters make. It should be noted that the students were looking at uppercase letters for this assessment, not lowercase letters. So, as you can see, again, our orange is the fall and the gray is the spring. There was a shift from the left to the right, which is what we want to see. In the fall, the least amount of sounds that a student could make was 19 letter sounds, followed by 2 that could make 20. So 3 students were 20 or below, and the rest were 22 or above. The most that any student could make was 25 out of 26 sounds, followed, which was also tied with 23 sounds, so each of those had 4 students who could do that. Then over here we see the fall sound assessment and the spring sound assessment, and again we made this shift over here. So most students could answer 25 letter sounds, and some could get all 26 in the spring. These were the letter sounds that were missed. In the fall, 6 students missed the letter E, 4 students missed the letter Q, so qua and and 5 students missed the letter Y, which makes ya. Then for the spring, 6 students still missed the letter E, which goes and 3 students still missed the letter Y, which goes ya. For the sight word assessment, there's another huge jump from the left side to the right side from the fall to the spring. This assessment, I sat with students one-on-one, and they read the sight words that they could read. And it was a list of 25 words, and they just went through it. If they could read it, that was great. If they couldn't read it in 2 seconds, then I told them what the answer was. So the least amount of words that a student could read in the fall was 5, and the most was 19. So 19 was high. That was 4 higher than the next highest student, and it was really quite a bit higher than most students, because most students were in this 7 to 11 range. So there was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 students were in the 7 to 11 range. And then in the spring, it looked totally different. The least amount of words that a student could read was 18, and the most was all 25 sight words. And as you can see, 23, 24, and 25, 2 students could read each, so that was 6 students could read those scores, and the next highest was 19 and 20, also at 2. For the observation notes, there's lots of things in our guided reading observation notes that I could have looked at. What I decided to look at was the monthly reading levels and the amount of students that were in those reading levels at the end of each month. So in November, 8 students were reading at a level A, and B were reading, and there were 5 students reading a B. In December, that shifted up, and 10 students were reading a B, and 3 students were reading a C, and those numbers stayed the same in January. And then in February, all students were reading level C by the end. So what I noticed when I looked at that last assessment, the observation notes, I couldn't find a direct connection between the number of books that were read and the reading level that the students were at. Some students moved from an A to a B after 2 books, and some took 3, and that seemed pretty normal. But then, from moving from a B to a C, that was much different. 1 student went from a B to a C after just 2 books, 2 students moved after 3 books, and the next group of students moved after 9 books. That was 3 students moved after 9, 3 moved after 10, and 4 moved after 11 books. So what I kind of did was put these kids into 2 different groups. So the group of 3 that moved after 2 or 3 books, and then the other kids that moved after 9 to 11. And I couldn't find a reason to believe that the number of books that were read were the reason that these kids were moving up in reading levels. So I kind of wondered what was the difference. Why were some kids moving and some not? If it had nothing to do with how many groups I was meeting with. This group of 3 was more prepared coming into school than the other 10 students. What I noticed when I looked at the letter identification assessment was that the letter Q was obviously the most difficult letter for the students to name. And I believe that this is true because this is how the Q looked on their assessment. And when we look at this Q, it does not have a tail. And the way that we teach how to write the letter Q, it always has a tail. Most kids identified the Q as a P, which if you go back and remember what Chip Wood was saying, he did tell us that students do a lot of letter reversals. And I think that without a tail on the Q, it made it really hard for students to decide that it was a Q or a P. I can't guarantee it, but I feel like if there were a tail, more students would have been able to identify it. What I noticed when I looked at the assessment, the journal assessment, was that it was kind of disheartening to see that 4 students at the end of the study did not or really did not like reading. One student's opinion even went from like to really dislike. So he was in that tall column where 10 kids said they liked reading at the beginning, and then he was the one that ended up saying he hated reading by the end. That was really discouraging to hear. And so what I thought about was that previous to kindergarten, students were predominantly being read to and not the ones reading. So before, they got to sit and listen to a story, and they got to have fun listening and imagining, and it wasn't any work. All they did was listen, and they thought, and they enjoyed it. But now they have to think about the words on a page. And if we remember what Chip Wood said earlier, he said that 5-year-olds may find reading and writing activities extremely frustrating if not closely related to their interests. Because I'm the one picking the books based on the things I discussed at the beginning and not to do with their interests, I think it makes it tough for kids to want to read because, as Chip Wood told us, they don't want to read unless they like it, unless they like the subject. So I think these had a lot of pull on how the students were feeling at the end of the study about reading. I would have expected that when looking at the letter sound and the letter ID assessments together, that if a student couldn't name a letter, it would make it difficult for them to name the sound. So what I was thinking was letter name and letter sound went hand in hand. What I found was that that's really not all that true. So only 5 students could not name the sound and the letter in the fall, and in the spring, only 1 student was not able to do a sound or name the letter at the same time. So basically, a letter name is a letter name, and a letter sound is a letter sound, and you can know one and not know the other, and that makes total sense, which surprised me throughout the study. I also could not find a direct connection in looking in the sight word assessment between the words that were explicitly taught and the words that the students knew. So in the fall, I had taught the students 5 words. And what I thought would happen would be that most students could get those 5 words. And what was in my study was that that wasn't really true. Students knew at least 5 words, but not necessarily the words that I taught. And even more so in the spring, when I looked at the assessment, the only 2 students that could actually name the 20 words that I had taught were the 2 students that could read all the words. So all the other students, they knew all these words and not necessarily the ones that I was teaching, which, leads me to believe that reading in context and reading sight words are kind of a different thing. I feel like those students would be able to identify those letters in a text, but not necessarily just off a piece of paper that had no meaning. So the limitations of this study, I thought there were a few, but the most prominent ones that I thought of were intervention and reading at home. So 9 out of 13 of my students in this study had intervention at one point during the year. So some students at the beginning of the study were in it and then ended up getting out. Some students were in it at the beginning and stayed in it. Some students weren't in it at the beginning and then joined intervention. So 9 out of 13 of my students had intervention at one point in the year. And I think that has a huge impact on why their reading made gains. They do guided reading in their intervention groups, and it's really hard to say if it was my guided reading or their guided reading or the combination of all the guided reading books that got them to move up, or if it was something else, or I don't know, could have been anything, could have been any reason that it happened, but I'd like to think that the extra guided reading through the interventionist really helped to boost these kids' reading scores. What else I thought was a limitation was the reading at home. And if you remember what Chipwood was saying about, or it wasn't Chipwood, it was the 3 earlier, but they said that early interaction with print is really important. And if kids have a literacy-rich home life, then they're going to already be boosted up before they come in. But if kindergarten is the first time they're really sitting and looking at words and looking at letters and reading books and listening to stories and all that kind of stuff, then I think that really is hard to say through this study, because I think that has a huge impact what happens at home, because they're only in school 5 days a week, 6 or 7 hours a day, and what happens at home makes up the other portion of their day. My key finding was that all of the students made gains in their reading level, letter sounds, letter names, and their sight word recognition. All students went in the positive. There were a few students who, in their letter names and sounds, they stayed the same. But those kids had already scored 23 or 24, and there's not much growth that can be made from there anyway. Other than that, everybody grew 3 reading levels. Everybody got many, many more sight words, and that was really amazing. What I would recommend to anybody who wanted to do this study in the future would be to ask why in the journal entry. Ask the kids to write why they feel the way that they feel. I would love to know why that student hated reading. I'd love to know why the 3 students love reading. I would love to know so much about why they feel the way that they feel, that if I were to do this study again, I would definitely add that in there. Also, if I could do this study again, I would collect data from the interventionists and get their guided reading notes and their levels and all the things that are in those observations to see if that had an impact on their guided reading levels. In conclusion, guided reading had a positive impact on kindergarten reading achievement. And these are my references. Any questions?
I just have a comment.
Sure.
I thought what you mentioned about the interest piece was very interesting, and I would be curious to know how we could incorporate more of the student interest into our guided reading groups.
Yeah, I don't really know how to do that. It'd be cool to have a wider selection of text that were at like the same levels but different like interests, and we could probably do, there's lots of interest studies like for students to see what they like, what they don't like, and things like that, and I think that would be amazing to put into guided reading, because I feel like that would make them more interested and more excited. I know when I've read, certain books with certain kids, they get really excited. Like when I read about trucks with one of my boys who's really excited about trucks, he was beyond excited. When I read about tigers with a girl who's obsessed with tigers, she absolutely adored the book. So I think that does have a huge impact on this. And I wonder too what we could do.
I would also be curious to see an assessment of their interest and enjoyment in reading once they become more confident readers.
Yeah.
And if that goes back up.
I hope so, because reading is and can be really fun. So I think you're right. There's a lot of struggle right now in the beginning, and as we push them into higher reading levels, they kind of feel uneasy about it and things like that. So I think it does get kind of hard for them to want to keep going when it's challenging, but they can persevere.
Thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah, anybody else? Thanks for coming.